Hi, friends of the planet. We're really excited to have with us Dr. Carolyn Kousky, who's the executive director of the Wharton Risk Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And we were really excited to talk to Dr. Kousky because flooding has been a very topical issue for our email, and especially after the recent floods in Nashville and natural disasters we've been seeing around the country. We wanted to talk to an expert about what this means for insurance and for homeowners. And we saw a paper that Dr. Kousky recently published in Risk Analysis about climate change and flood insurance. And so we knew that she was the one that could give us some great information. So Dr. Kousky, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So your expertise is really relevant to a lot of stories we've been writing in our Daily Planet about extreme weather, natural disasters, and how those risks affect people like homeowners and how that affects flood insurance. So I wanted to ask a little bit of historical context about the National Flood Insurance Program. I was hoping that maybe you could fill that in for us about how it came to be and why in the era of climate change it's becoming financially unsound and kind of what the breaking points with this program are.
So flood insurance is generally not available on the private market. There's some exceptions to that, and the private market has been growing. But generally, most residential flood insurance is provided through our federal program, the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, which is housed in FEMA. And it's been around for over 5 decades now. So it really is an institution of federal flood policy in the US. And it was really created in response to a lack of private sector availability for flood. The program, though, has never really been designed or priced to handle catastrophic events. And unfortunately, as we know, floods can be very catastrophic, right? So Hurricane Katrina is really the event that started it on this sort of downward financial cycle. It went billions of dollars into debt after that event, which was, of course, 2005. The program has borrowing authority from the US Treasury. So unlike a private sector firm where you'd have to have access to capital to pay your claims, either from things like reinsurance or enough savings or whatever, the sort of insurance company version of savings, the NFIP just borrows from the Treasury. That's what sent it into debt. And it has not been able to pull itself out of that because we've just seen more and more storms, right? So we had Hurricane Ike, we had Hurricane Sandy, right? We've seen the recent storms we've had. After Hurricane Harvey, Congress forgave about $16 billion of the debt. So that was a sort of taxpayer infusion into the program. It's still now about $20 billion in debt. And FEMA, GAO, anyone who sort of looked at the program has said there's no way it's going to get out from under this. Like, you really just have to forgive the debt.
People don't think about that, make claims. They're frustrated when they can't get flood insurance because they're not in an official flood zone, and those flood zones are changing and the FEMA maps are sort of out of date. There's just so many issues that need to be corrected with this program. One of them you mentioned was flood insurance rates might be something that could help make up for this lack of coverage, or this debt that the program is in. But the Senate doesn't really seem inclined to do that. Is that something we should really be looking at, raising the rates? Is it cheaper? I mean, it's hard to say when there's no private comparison, right?
So you're referring to something that FEMA is calling Risk Rating 2.0, which is its new approach to pricing. And I think it might help to give a little bit of background on what FEMA is doing now to help explain why I actually think this is a really important effort. So right now, prices are set in the program based on these very broad flood zones. Flood risk actually varies a lot more than these big zones reflect. And the program has been using an approach to sort of modeling risk that's like decades old. It's from like when the program was started, and it has not kept up with advancements in technology, in data, in our methods for modeling flood hazard, which have really just grown dramatically over the last few decades. And so the first thing that this new pricing approach is going to do is just modernize the way it sets rates and make it in line with industry standards. And so I think that's just really important across the board to kind of get better data and methods being used. Another thing is that it's going to make it a lot easier to understand your risk, because it'll make clear if you have a high price, it's because, you're at risk of coastal storm surge, or you're near a river, or you're in a low area and it could rain really hard. I think that communication is going to be better. It's going to make it easier for agents to write the policy. Some colleagues and I did some research. It's actually such a confusing program right now. If you're an insurance agent and you don't focus on flooding a lot, it can be really easy to make all sorts of mistakes. And then we found those often really hurt the consumer because you might end up paying way too much. You might not have the right policy. And so it can actually be just a big mess, and that'll kind of get fixed. But one important thing to understand about what FEMA is doing right now is that it's going to undo this really regressive cross subsidy and pricing that currently exists in the program. So right now, high value homes are not paying enough and low value homes are paying too much. And so to the extent you think low income people are in lower valued homes and higher income people are in higher valued homes, this is regressive. FEMA knows about this and it's going to be correcting it. So from an equity standpoint, it's actually really important to let this pricing reform move ahead. My personal preferred policy approach that I'd like to see here is that Congress provide means tested assistance to lower income, moderate income families who can't afford flood insurance. So directly help those who need the help instead of just suppressing rates across the board.
I wanted to kind of pick up on that thread of helping people that need the most help, because some of the things we've written about in our Daily Planet are, for instance, after California's wildfires or Hurricane Harvey, people who had insurance were still really suffering. So they were stuck living in unsafe housing, or they were making decisions to forego necessities because the insurance policies they had weren't sufficient to see them through the recovery time. So I wanted to ask, what policy mechanisms could we possibly use to ensure that insurance actually gives people the help that they need and the full help that they need?
I like to think about this sort of from the point of view of disaster recovery. And there's really 4 big buckets of financial resources that people can make use of after a big disaster event. They could use their savings, they could apply for a loan, they could get assistance from the government or from an NGO, or they could have insurance. And the problem we're seeing right now is that, especially for low and moderate income households, but even others, are struggling with any of these sources of recovery. And when you don't have the financial resources for recovery, it has all sorts of negative aspects, not just you're financially stuck, but that creates stress and anxiety and mental health problems. You might have to be diverting funds from other important uses. So like you have to spend less on medical care because you have to make your home safe. So it has all these really terrible consequences for families when they don't have the financial resources. The federal government aid, unfortunately, people don't recognize is really limited. So there's lots of localized disaster events that don't get any federal assistance at all.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And then even the big events, right? So like all our big major hurricanes will get federal dollars. It takes so long and it's much more limited than people think.
Right. First thing covers a tiny bit of what they've sustained in terms of damage.
That's exactly right. Like our FEMA grants, I think the average amount people get is like a few $1,000s. So it doesn't come close to rebuilding. You could get, for the really big events, HUD also distributes funds to state and local governments. But the time between when the disaster happens and when HUD dollars are actually spent in a community, literally years. I mean, years.
Wow.
Right. Look at how long it took for Sandy to rebuild, all the effort. And there's so many people who never were able to rebuild and just had to leave. And that is a climate refugee problem in our own country.
I mean, we could have a whole conversation, I'm sure you've had lots of them, on how you like better fix our federal disaster aid, but you can't count on that. And so that's why insurance is so important, to bring us back to kind of the flood insurance program. But then you get into this problem that the people who need the insurance the most are the least able to afford it.
Right. You know, these disasters don't happen to one house. Like in Texas, a lot of people's pipes burst because of the freeze that they experienced, and they didn't have power and they didn't have a chance to shut off their water, and now their homes are destroyed. But it didn't happen just one, it happened to entire cities. How do we deal with this, particularly when it comes to climate and these disasters are community based?
You said that exactly right, because that is really the challenge here. And it's why disaster insurance is always fundamentally more expensive than non-disaster insurance. Just like you said, like when you think about something like auto insurance, claims are fairly stable year to year. And every year, some people are getting in car accidents. Right. And so you can use the premium revenue from that year to pay claims. And it's like classic risk pooling, right? Like everyone puts in a little every year, and one year it's you who needs it. Right. And disasters just aren't like that.
That way.
Exactly. Like you'll have quiet years, and then all of a sudden you need crazy amounts of money to pay all these claims for the entire community that has been hit. And so like a private insurance company, in order to write coverage for something like that type of disaster, has to have access to, you know, reinsurance or insurance-linked securities, or they're holding capital. And all of those things are expensive, and they pass on those costs to the insured, which is why disaster insurance just fundamentally costs more.
So should there be federal disaster insurance that's like the federal flood insurance program, backed by the federal government, but provided by private insurers, so that they don't have to worry that they're going to go out of business?
Yeah, I think something like that's a really great model. And it's one that's been used in other countries. So I think like France and Spain and maybe New Zealand, I forget exactly, but there's a number of other countries around the world that have taken this fundamental approach, where what they do is they charge everyone a fee, and it's not very much. It's a modest fee. And they require that insurers include all natural disasters in the property policy, right? And then if a disaster event occurs that's so big that it threatens to send insurance companies insolvent, then the federal government steps in and backstops those insurance companies so that they don't have to worry about bankruptcy associated with providing disaster coverage. The challenge in the US, right, is that there's a lot of path dependency, and we've really taken this sort of peril by peril approach to insurance in this country, which I think is too bad.
And, you know, something that we've seen in insurance companies do for homeowners that live in high risk areas is that these people can't buy a policy even if they can afford one or want one. And I think that this is probably just going to get worse. So what do we do about a future where there are millions of homes that are not insurable and they're in big metro areas like Dallas or Los Angeles or San Francisco
or Nashville?
Yeah, and any of these places, especially, in California, which is a state that already is really struggling with housing insecurity.
Yeah, this is a really tough issue. And I know California struggled with it, right? Like after the 2017 and 2018 fires, they saw insurance companies like not want to keep writing policies and kind of rising rates. We really need to get out ahead of this, right? To try to stabilize these insurance markets before we're at a crisis point, because we've seen crisis points before, actually. We've also seen that we're not super good at designing really good public policy in the crunch of the chaos of a crisis. Yeah. The thing that's most obvious and somehow the hardest is that, as we were talking about before, insurance prices reflect risk. And so these places that are going to be facing these insurability crises are high risk areas. I think it's wrong to be thinking about this as an insurance pricing problem. It's a high risk problem. And if you think of it as a high risk problem, there's a range of other solutions, right? Which have to do with building better, not building in some areas altogether. And yet those are things that like lots of communities, lots of local governments, lots of people don't want to deal with. They're hard. It's going to be harder in areas like California where there's already a lot of pressure on housing. But to the extent that we can incorporate sort of saying in the highest risk areas, we shouldn't be putting people and capital there. It's not economic. And if we are putting them in some risky areas, because some risky areas it will make economic sense to continue to build, let's do it safer. We know how to build buildings that are much more resistant to wildfire than most of the ones being built, that are much more resistant to flood and hurricanes than most of the ones being built. So I think that's sort of like the most important thing is the actual risk reduction. But then we've also been doing some work at the center on thinking about innovating on the insurance model. How could we keep providing insurance in the face of these sort of escalating threats? So we've been looking at things like parametric insurance and micro insurance and community-based insurance, like a whole bunch of different models to try to continue to provide the financial resilience that insurance can offer.
We realize that now in the midst of this pandemic that government can help us, and then when pooling our risk can help us. It scares me to think that Miami may become like the next New York City, that people are moving there because it's such a nice place to live, but it's so risky. We really need to deal with some of these challenges so that we aren't hurting people by encouraging them to go places where they can't live without potentially being very much damaged by these storms and other climate related problems.
In my mind, there's two like really big concerns I have with that. One is that you see like in the news often and stuff, people who end up purchasing property and living places where they had no idea about what they were getting into. And that's just really sad. People can be left struggling for so many years when if they just had better information, they wouldn't have done it. The second thing is our use of public dollars. Coastal amenities are huge and wonderful. We're going to continue to make use of them, but we're dealing with real sea level rise for like years, decades to come. And so how much of those costs should really be subsidized and socialized? I don't think it necessarily makes sense for the public sector to be underwriting the cost of continued occupancy in some of these like really risky areas. But on the flip side of that, because those risky areas are so delightful, you also don't want to create this sort of equity thing where you lock lower income people out of those coastal amenities. So it is not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask, as a millennial, I know a lot of my peers are becoming first-time homeowners, and something that we haven't really heard from our parents, or there are not a lot of resources out there. How should millennials be thinking about extreme weather risk and risk in general when purchasing a home? What are some resources they might turn to understand if this property they're purchasing is a good first investment, or if they might incur a lot of unexpected costs and a lot of unexpected risks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and comes back to this thing we are just talking about with people not knowing. Unfortunately, we're not making it easy enough for people to have that information, not just about the full range of risks of the property today, but where it's going in the future. The current disclosure laws and stuff we have are just woefully inadequate for that right now. And so unfortunately, that puts a burden on the buyer, I think, to be more aggressive in trying to get that information themselves and to think about hazard risk as one component of the things that you're thinking about, along with school district, the neighborhood, and how big the house in the yard is, whatever else goes into your kind of rubric for deciding where you want to live. The challenge, though, is that in some places it's really hard to get that information, even if you're thinking about it. And there's been some attempts to do this better. So I'm actually on the advisory board of the First Street Foundation. They've been working with like real realtor.com to try to put flood risk like right in there so that when you go to get the information, you see it. But we need that with all the hazards, right? And we also need like your realtor, your insurance agent to be well versed in these climate risks to help people understand them. Because it's also not just how risks are changing and what they are to live or not live there, but there are things we can do, adjustments to our home that we can make to make our home safer or not. A good resource on that is the Institute for Building and Home Safety. They have a lot of good information, but I think it would be much nicer if all of that was just packaged,
Yeah, like you look on Zillow and it can all be there. That would be great. Dr. Kousky, thank you so much for this conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I know that our readers and viewers will learn a lot too. This is really topical, and especially after what we saw in Nashville happen this past week. Thank you for giving us some important stats and ideas and things to consider.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It was so fun to talk to both of you.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
We really appreciate it. Keep up the great work at Wharton.
Thank you. Take care.